Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lynn Holland, and I'm the administrator at SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, Ageism in Tech, using an online survey as a qualitative tool with Stephanie. And I already told Stephanie I'm going to brutally mispronounce her last name. So get ready, folks. It's Hatzifilaithis. Close? Okay. Close. Anyway, so let us begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us, and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. Stephanie earned her PhD in social gerontology here at McMaster University, and she's currently a postdoctoral fellow. I'm sorry, I'm just admitting other people. There we go.
No worries.
In the Department of Health, Aging, and Society. Her work has focused on intergenerational dynamics, co-housing, and ageism, and brings an interdisciplinary lens to challenges facing aging populations. Alongside Dr. Nicole Dahlner, her postdoctoral work looks to how older people's digital landscapes are designed, experienced, and embodied. In her spare time, she enjoys wandering around new cities, hiking, and all things food. I'm with you there. So I'll hand it over to Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you for the introduction, Lynn. Is my screen okay? Everything's good? Yes?
Yes.
We're good. Okay, so as Lynn mentioned, I do work at McMaster as a postdoctoral fellow alongside lovely humans, including Dr. Nicole Dahlner in the Department of Health, Aging, and Society. A bit about me, if you couldn't tell from my long last name, I was born in Canada, but I lived in Greece for a wee bit of time, where I did my undergraduate degree in psychology at the International Faculty of the University of Sheffield. And that is kind of where I fell in love with the field of gerontology. I then decided it was a great idea to leave the sunny beaches and the great Mediterranean for the glorious UK. And that's where I lived in London, and that is where I studied cognitive neuroscience. And I decided to move back to Canada for my PhD, as Lynn mentioned, in social gerontology at McMaster. My research and my community work has always really focused around later life, breaking down age-based stereotypes, and understanding ways to really improve relations across generations. My research with Nicole Dahlner now focuses on ageism and digital technologies, and what we're really keen on doing is examining and looking at how older people think about, talk about, and experience technologies and their related data, and how that plays a role in their lives, which I will talk a bit about later on. So a bit of an overview. So what I'm going to do is briefly outline what ageism is, talk a little bit about my research and some projects that I'm currently working on with Dr. Nicole Dahlner and Dr. Cal Byrook. I will also highlight the use of the online survey and how it can be used as a qualitative tool, and then hopefully answer some of your questions or any thoughts that you may have. Feel free to add to the chat box during the talk as well, and then we can also answer them at the end, or I'm happy to answer during as well. So to start us off, why don't we take a couple of seconds here to really reflect on these two questions. And so feel free to add your response in the chat box. But for one, what was the last thing you said or thought you were too old for? And then two, what was the last thing you said or thought you were too young for? So sometimes, you can have, let's say, question one could be, let's say, go back to school or change careers or something along those lines. So Shiva, too old for the new lingo and using TikTok. Yep.
I agree with her on that.
Equity, yep. Too young to go to bed at 9 p.m. Honestly, cup of peppermint tea, good book. Too old to party for the whole night. Yep. Too old for a CrossFit session. 46. Okay. Too old to play specific sports. Yeah, that's always a very common one, especially when it comes to physical activity. Okay, so feel free to populate the chat box if you want as we go, but as I said before, oftentimes we kind of get responses to questions, such as, let's say to question 1, which is, as we said, like, physical activity, things like that, changing careers, going to bars, going out late at night, dyeing your hair blue, waking up late, and so forth. And to question 2, often we hear things like, going to be a grandparent, or utilizing, let's say, a specific assistive device, or access specific programming that targets towards, let's say, later life or seniors, or even to be getting gray hair. So I always like using these using this to kind of open, because it's always an interesting way to start off, because I think it also helps us hold ourselves accountable and see that ageism is often internalized, and it cuts both ways. So, as the great Ashton Applewhite has mentioned, by holding these kind of assumptions within ourselves, it really robs society of an immense knowledge and experience. And it also tends to poison our futures by framing longer and healthier lives as problems, instead of, let's say, the remarkable achievements and opportunities that they do represent. So let's begin to, to dig in a bit deeper here to really better understand this concept and where we might see traces or examples of ageism in our day-to-day lives. So coined in 1968 by the gerontologist Robert Butler, ageism refers to the stereotypes, prejudices, or discriminations that we might hold towards others or ourselves based on age. It is often said that ageism continues to be one of the most visible, socially accepted, and tolerated forms of discrimination today. And these negative attitudes and beliefs about aging and older people underpin and tend to drive age discrimination in places that are commonplace, like healthcare, social care, the workplace, the legal system, and of course, in different forms of technology and tech roles as well. And the World Health Organization released a report, the Global Report on Ageism, back in 2021. And what they reported is that 1 in 2 people worldwide are ageist against older people. And oftentimes these people tend to be older people themselves, because who will be the most ageist? The people who are exposed to it the longest as well. So they pointed out in this report that ageism affects us throughout the life course, and exists not only within ourselves, but also within the institutions and the relationships that we have with other people. And oftentimes it's important to mention that ageism exacerbates other forms of discrimination, including, ableism, sexism, and racism. So we have that working definition of ageism kind of under our belt. So let's kind of turn to this, some examples of how ageism works in our everyday lives, because oftentimes ageism is invisible and often tolerated. So it's easy for us to sometimes miss, the appearance of it and how it kind of shows up. So here's some quick examples of the many domains in our everyday lives where we might witness or encounter ageism. And so first, you can see here the street sign for, let's say, a seniors crossing. And we see older people depicted as naturally humped over, inferring that they're necessarily physically frail. And so this type of symbolism kind of enters into and shapes our social conventions and ways of thinking. And I'll get to that in a bit. But the second image here, represents an example of ageism in, let's say, memes, right? We see a lot of them, let's say, boomer remover, and all these really fun taglines that people have come up with, or hashtags. And so these images are easily and quickly circulated throughout the internet. And while memes are intended to be funny, memes such as this one tend to poke fun at, let's say, the stereotypes of older people necessarily being computer illiterate. Despite mountains of research that show, that lived experiences of older people being tech savvy and actually quite creative with technologies. Finally, the third photo represents an ever expanding number of products. It was actually once I went to, I think it was Party City, and I was going to pick up something for a friend's birthday. And I just noticed this whole section that was, basically products of poking fun at growing older. And this, always having age be the brunt of the joke or something to be laughed at while also cringing, at getting older. I don't know the last time someone picked up a birthday card that didn't have age being the brunt of the joke. And so the language we use to talk about aging really impacts our impressions and our perceptions, right? So, for example, if I say the word elderly, right, what comes to mind? What do you see? What do they look like? What are they wearing? Where are they? If I say, though, older person, do you picture a different person? So just like the images we saw, here, they transmit meaning, right? So do the words that we use. And languages and images convey meaning, which can feed assumptions and judgments that can lead to different types of behavior, ageist behaviors and ageist thinking. So the way that we really frame our communications, including the language and the images that we use, it affects how people think, feel, and act towards people and different age groups. And older people in news, let's say, policy and media, have been depicted as being, let's say, dependent or a growing burden, people who are depleting society's reserves, describing the growing number of aging older people as, let's say, the gray tsunami, the silver tsunami, or the rising tide or age quake, as depicted, And so these overgeneralizations and the frames of aging as a problem, they really induce this fear-based imagery and a language that unfortunately poses older people and positions older people as a problem that requires either extensive support or tends to lump, let's say, a lot of older people into one singular category and really neglects to understand the diversity within those age categories. So instead, what I really wanted to do is, acknowledge that having the same age doesn't necessarily mean that you're the same. And second, it's key to position information about, let's say, population aging in a way that's neutral, right? Allowing for, in the case of what we were just talking about, a balanced presentation of the opportunities and the challenges associated with demographic transitions, and also acknowledging that those are often systemic in nature and not individually based. As I said before, I wish I could talk about this in a much, I wish I had more time to talk about this, but ageism definitely intersects and interacts with other forms of stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination, right? And it's layered. And so there are certain groups that may experience unique barriers because of their age, but that's also in combination with, let's say, gender, disability, sexual orientation, race, color, ethnicity, religion, culture, and language. One good example of that, women in particular tend to experience the combined effects of both sexism and ageism, and that definitely has been shown to influence people's productivity, self-perception and identity, career decisions, retirement intentions, and work satisfaction as well. So ageism. You're like, okay, great stuff. This is great to know, but how does it actually affect us? Ageism has serious and far-reaching consequences for people's health and well-being. We always like to say that it's one of the only forms of discrimination that is universal. And so what that means is that if you're lucky, you will get old. And if you're lucky, you will basically be discriminating against your future self. So for older people, ageism is really associated with a shorter lifespan by about 7.5 years, poor physical and mental health, slower recovery from disability and cognitive decline. Ageism tends to reduce older people's quality of life, increase social isolation, loneliness, and both which are, interlinked with different types of health problems and well-being issues. It restricts their ability to express their sexuality, may increase the risk of violence and abuse against older people. And ageism also increases risky health behaviors, such as, let's say, eating an unhealthy diet, drinking excessively, or smoking. And as I mentioned before about the World Health Organization's global report on ageism, they note that ageism actually contributes to poverty and financial insecurity in older age. And one recent estimate shows that ageism actually costs society about a couple $2 billion. And so another serious impact of ageism is internalized ageism. And I don't know if anybody's heard of embodied ageism, but it's basically people as they age will internalize these stereotypes about what it means to get older. I'm sure plenty of people said, oh, I had a senior moment when they forgot something. Meanwhile, it's very common. I'm a 29-year-old who forgets and had put keys in my fridge multiple times. And so once you arrive at, what people perceive to be old, people's decisions are often influenced by the lens of these internalized stereotypes that have been exposed to their whole lives. So, and these can include, decisions around work, your career, your love life, anything really. So what they think can or shouldn't do is then impacted by these beliefs, right? And the beliefs that we place upon ourselves. And so for example, let's say in the workforce, internalized ageism can result in, let's say, self-exclusion from continued training, or assuming people are too old for training and promotion, or changing jobs, or even have the right to work altogether. And so to turn to my research, when it comes to the development and distribution of technology, ageism really does have important implications. It not only shapes whether new technologies are adopted by older people, but it also influences how new technologies are developed and marketed. So in recent years, there has been an increasing awareness of how digital technologies and platforms can discriminate on the basis of gender, race, and class. However, ageism has received less attention. And so artificial intelligence, healthcare technologies, monitoring and surveillance systems, among many, many, many others, are really increasingly being integrated into the lives of older people. And so we do know, I'm not a tech hater, although I feel like tech hates me, but technologies do play vital roles in everyday life. And it's what we really want to do in our research is really investigate how older people's use of technology is influenced by ageism and vice versa, including self-perception, and as I said before, identity. And so that is really the basis of most of my research with Dr. Dallmer. We study how ageism is both produced and reproduced in the context of experience and design. And we look at how older people think about, talk about, and experience technologies and their related data. And so we're really interested in how those who are involved, let's say, in the design and the development of technologies understand the potential effects of ageism. And we really hope to not only create better technologies, but to also avoid potentially costly barriers to technology adoption, and hopefully alleviate the increasing challenges of technology-related discrimination, exclusion, and inclusion that, unfortunately, for better or for worse, explicitly and implicitly color and shape our perceptions of aging. So now I'm going to turn to a study that I've been working alongside Dr. Dallmer, Dr. Bayruk, that examined how data and our experiences with data, how our experiences with data, how older people's experiences with data is experienced and understood. And so one motivating factor in this line of research was really an interest in complicating really the common sense narrative upheld by media stories about either older people and data, right, or older adults and technology. We mentioned before about ageism. We talked a little bit about this, but we see it very blatantly in some headlines, for example, that talk about a digital divide or digital exclusion, or suggesting that older people tend to lag behind the rest of the population in their ability to either access the internet or navigate technology in a sophisticated way. So there's also this widespread assumption that older people are technologically illiterate, they dislike technological devices, or will inevitably get scammed if they get hooked into the digital world. And so while there are definitely issues and there's certainly legitimate concerns, these stories really pay very little attention to what older people actually think about and do in terms of data and technology, really painting them as passive victims rather than curious agents within their own relationships and ideas about data and tech. So in this way, part of the interest of our ongoing research is really to find out what older people actually think and do with their technologies, and how do they think about their data and data objects more generally. So when we started looking more in depth, existing research from a biomedical perspective really focused on how technologies may function as part of interventions, as I said before, aimed at surveilling, monitoring, behavior modification. We've all seen those commercials, either with, the emergency switch, or those, smart homes that are have been or are being completely integrated into older people's lives. However, scholars haven't yet paid much attention to the consequences of framing digital technologies, let's say, as fixes for age-related health and mobility issues, or for, let's say, social isolation. So what does making technology a solution for everything mean about how our social world's values and expectations of others, how are those changing? And these are kind of the questions that we were really interested in. And in response to all of this, we really wanted to gather older people's own understandings of their own digital devices, their own data objects, and focus in particular on their definitions and the languages that they assign to and associate with these devices. So we're interested in hearing people's stories about data and digital technologies, the roles they play in their lives, their attachments or potentially their aversions to them, the pleasure and the risk that they see in using them, and the ways that data becomes part of the self. So in particular, in our first phase, see, tech really doesn't like me. So in particular, in our first phase of research, we draw on findings that from a virtual survey circulated among older Canadians over the spring and summer months in 2022. In particular, this paper, what we're writing up right now, really draws on findings from a virtual survey that we circulated among older Canadians over the spring and summer months in 2022. In the survey, older people were the respondents and participants, and we really asked them to share their understandings of data and the ways in which data and data objects circulate and shape their everyday lives. As I said before, our main aim was really to trouble the normative premises and the dynamics of power underlying discourses and assumptions about age-related tech, innovation, and also data production. We did have some challenges, as some would figure, just given the context of securing in-person ethics due to COVID. So we pivoted and we used this survey as a way to establish a baseline for future inquiry by getting a sense of, the terms and language that older people employ. But this, even though the survey was potentially unplanned, it was actually a lot more fruitful and revealing than we could have ever anticipated and imagined. And it also helped kind of spark a new interest in a new method, which I'll talk about in a bit. And so in this study, we had 70 respondents aged range between 60 and 83, with a mean age of 69. And we had an overwhelming response from Ontario and Albertan folk. More so, the reason for that is because my postdoc supervisor is from Alberta. And so we had a lot of people and networks from there as well, and also the networks that we have here in Ontario. We did do our best to try to recruit from across Canada, including the territories, but about 46% of our respondents were from Ontario. So with this kind of background under our belts, well, now I'm going to turn to some preliminary results that are stemming from the survey data and what that looked like. So one of the first questions that we asked participants is, define data in your own words. And so while we might be familiar with more technical or formal definitions of the use data, so you could think about it as collections of information that help us understand a situation or a phenomenon, we really wanted to invite and include and integrate older people's understandings of data, and as it makes sense to their everyday lives. So following this question, participants filled out the survey, and they were prompted to list the first 3 words or phrases that came to mind when you hear the word data. And so older people completed the survey, had a number of different words or concepts that were associated with data, and information was the word that was most often associated or linked to data. And that was kind of followed by more quantitative and numerical terms such as numbers, research, analysis, and statistics. And as you can see, there is no academic talk that is necessary without a word cloud. So we have one here that we created. And so as we continue to kind of wade through the responses, what we also detected is this presence of a division in a way, or for lack of a better word, in the terms participants associated or used with data. So for some of them who listed terms such as, let's say, facts, trustworthy, factual, useful, convenient, informative, there's this underlying sense of confidence and optimism surrounding the concept of data. However, there was this, other participants where their 3 words began to hint at, let's say, their uneasiness or wariness of data. So their words, such as possibly not secure, limited, personal, be aware of scams. Where is the data going? Who wants it? Why do they want it? And what is it going to be used for? So one thing that we immediately noticed in the responses that we examined, and in line with the interests that we had of kind of like building this, let's say, critical lexicon of data talk and terminology from the perspectives of older people, was really that numerous participants used the space allotted for open-ended responses to our prompts to work out, let's say, uncertainties or really present guesswork as to what we might be seeking from them. So for instance, one question asked participants to define data objects from their own perspectives. And we elected to use this broad term purposely because we really wanted to elicit the widest possible range of responses, rather than, specifically asking things that might fall under the term, let's say, the phone, tablet, or laptops that, let's say, was identified here by Eloise, for instance. And so data objects is a term that really reflects our scholarly and theoretical interest in the materiality of data and data technologies, and is likely more familiar to people in that field and in those realms. But Eloise really zeroed in on specific objects, as you can see, but it nonetheless became clear that the term felt initially unfamiliar or too broad or inaccessible to other participants. You could see Roberta, George, John. And so, for instance, they experienced this uncertainty and they contextualized their responses as guesses. So while an online survey may not provide us an in-depth contextualized or ethnographic understandings of everyday interactions, but I will circle back to that towards the end, between older people, data, and data technologies, it's important to understand that nonetheless, we gained a lot of great insights from the survey exercise, and also gained some understanding of some common ways older people have articulated the utility of their attraction to data objects, as we've kind of turned them. So the responses to this question, for example, what draws you to use data objects, might help us design future research instruments that add that nuance to responses, like those provided, let's say, by Kathleen or Jason here, right? Jason uses the term wise here, which really begs the question of how older people arbitrate or compare the quality of information that they access via their devices. So you can look at Janet and Navneet's responses, who provide us a glimpse at the vernacular phrases and, let's say, the metaphors that characterize data talk and reflections, right? The internet in my pocket, or, the data black hole. And so Navneet's response, too, really signals that they approach their devices thoughtfully and critically, right? Connection, a term that's often employed in a more celebratory way to describe, let's say, the affordances of data objects for older people, especially, amid COVID. But it's not a universal good for Navneet, right? But one that must be, let's say, tempered with, let's say, periodic disconnection or avoidance. So, as I said, there's plenty we have a lot of data and a lot of really fun information that we're sifting through now and writing up the paper. And so our online survey produced some, perhaps, let's say, unexpected metadata. Rather than merely gathering information, it also helped us to gain familiarity with older people's domains of language and thought. Such insights really helped prove useful in designing future research instruments with this population, for example. As we said before, it really helped us understand the vernacular terms or the deeper understandings of the nuanced meanings and definitions that our sample tended to assign to data. And finally, I think older people really utilize the space of the survey to critically engage with our work and assumptions as researchers too. On an earlier slide, you'll see that we had a bit of that pushback from some respondents giving our use of the term data objects. And some, really a sense of real frustration with the unknown term came through. I still remember some of the responses were like, I have no clue what this word means, I will not respond. So even our assumption that those in our sample, let's say, were older adults, our demographic interest in adults was over the age of 60. That was also critiqued, right, by some respondents who expressed that they were surprised to be considered older people, or suggested that we break up the age range because it needed to be provided in more, precise increments given the diversity that exists within those age groups. And so they said, some people would comment, well, as a 61-year-old, it's not the same as a 90-year-old. And we would wholeheartedly agree. And as we said before, this was just a really great way of seeing this a bit more expressed in a more forthright way. And so now I'm going to turn to the importance of the method that we use. And I think that's maybe more interesting given the context of what Spark does as well. And so we also have been thinking about the importance of the method that we chose in order to use in understanding older people's experience. So we have and are continuing to think through the possibilities of an online survey as a qualitative research tool, but we found this article that is absolutely brilliant. And if you do have the time, please do take the time to read it if you're interested in qualitative work and surveys. But what we really wanted to see is how is the qualitative tool used? How are other people using it? And what I wanted to do is kind of give you a bit of an overview of how we used it, how we think about it, and also kind of what the literature says about qualitative tools. So the survey is a familiar tool in social research, right? Mixed method versions really incorporate variable amounts of qualitative data collection, but we really believe that the rich potential qualitative data can offer is often not realized through data collection and or analysis. So as I said before, if anybody's ever worked with qualitative work, you'll know that oftentimes surveys are not used. They're not often collected in that way. And so people tend to prioritize other types of qualitative techniques, right? But qualitative surveys tend to, on average, seek to harness the potential qualitative data and provide a more nuanced, in-depth, and sometimes new understandings of social issues. So qualitative surveys consist of a series of open-ended questions. They're crafted by the researcher, yours truly, or other teams, and centered on a particular topic, right? They're typically, as most surveys, are self-administered with questions that are presented in a fixed or standard order to all participants. So participants respond really by typing out their responses in their own words, and rather than selecting them from, let's say, a multiple choice or predetermined response options. And so fully qualitative surveys can really produce, or at least in our experience, really help produce rich and complex accounts of the type of sense making typically of interest to qualitative researchers, such as, let's say, participants' subjective experiences, their narratives, their practices, their positionings, their discourse. And so within the framework of what is important to the researcher, qualitative survey data tends to capture what is most important to participants, right? And it really accesses, at least the way that we see it, is that it really accesses their language and their terminology, both frequently claimed as, let's say, advantages in the context of qualitative research. So I wanted to mention here designing the survey. I think it's really important to think how we can go about this a bit more practically, what that looks like, if it differs from, let's say, in-person one-on-one interviews. And I think the biggest thing is, question wording is often a question that we would get, when we've presented some of this work, it's like, okay, well, does that changed? And so, in Braun and Clark's article, they talk about these different two types of questions. They talk about topic-based and demographic. And this is important because, again, for those of you who have engaged, let's say, in one-on-one interviews, question wording is crucial. And so in a fixed design, like a survey, you don't necessarily have the ability to evolve a question, to probe, to help clarify individual responses. So they need to really be, to the point and very clear. So we have found it's really important to avoid making assumptions about the meanings participants might attribute to specific concepts and terminology in the questions that you're asking. So we have managed this, I think, by making it clear how we defined key terms, provide clear definitions once and after specific questions were asked. And also this helps clarify, but also signals to participants a more inclusive approach. And so good qualitative survey questions tend to be generally open, short, express as clearly as possible. And what we tried to do, and what most research in this area tends to try to do, is avoid making assumptions about how participants might think or feel or experience a particular things, right? And I think in the context of, let's say, quantitative research, this would be considered the valence of the question itself. So you don't want to have like a leading question where it's like, oh, older people have negative experiences of tech, explain or discuss, right? You want to avoid making assumptions. And that's important to participants, let's say, with diverse experiences or views, to also feel included, but also to include the widest range of possible answers. And so a qualitative survey tends to start out with a big and broad open question, like, please tell me about your experience of XYZ, or tell me about a day in your life. And so some participants will inevitably write, see above. I saw plenty of already answered in some of the responses to some or all of the later questions. And if most or all participants do this, I think it's just an indicator that maybe we need to revisit or rework some of those questions. But the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of people doing qualitative surveys will cluster, let's say, questions that are very similar to this, like a specific aspect of the topic together. For longer surveys, oftentimes you'll see them separated with main questions into two or different coherent sections. The thing is also as well, which is really useful, I think at the end, it's like as you would with a, let's say, one-on-one interview, you always want to end the survey with the final open question. Is there anything else you would like to add about things? Because sometimes you may not gather all the information that you need, but people will feel more inclined to add their thoughts and perceptions maybe more openly later on. And this oftentimes really generates really fruitful and unanticipated and really, really lovely like little nuggets of data. And so the other thing is length. I mean, I feel like everyone can agree here that nobody wants to be taking a survey for 45 minutes. And so that's another thing to consider. They do tend to take a lot longer than multiple choice, quite obvious, but qualitative surveys, you can ask a few topic-based questions, and typically they shouldn't be more than the literature suggests more than around 10 questions. Ours was around 15, but we're not going to get into that. Again, we live and we learn. But it's very much an understanding of, you don't want people, let's say, to have fatigue, right? And the longer the survey, the greater the potential for a participant to disengage or, maybe potentially increasingly write shorter or more incomplete responses. And so we have found that that's been really helpful in considering you want to think about participant motivation as well. And their commitment to answering these questions when determining, let's say, the length of your survey. The other thing is piloting. It's really important to talk about, and think through some of these questions, let's say with a group or a small research group, a small focus group of people of your, let's say, your demographic pool, and what that would look like and feel like to them, and then make the edits and the changes. So analyze, I'm not going to get too much into this, but basically oftentimes people can think about, let's say, analyzing qualitative surveys, let's say by question, and people will just, dub them as, let's say, themes. But the more interpretive, the more potential there is that meaning will not necessarily be attached to particular responses to questions. So you kind of have to suppress the urge to just, summarize the data based off of one question. And you really want to attach, and look at the data as a whole, and just really think about it through there and not necessarily attach meaning to a specific response, but look at it as a collective as well. So a couple of advantages, and I will talk about the disadvantages as well, and I will come to an end soon. But a key advantage, I think, of online surveys is openness and flexibility to really address a wide range of research questions of interest to social researchers. Because the method really allows access to data that range in a focus from people's views, experiences, material practices, and their own meaning-making practices. And it's not to say that that can't happen in person, but the range of possible questions also, I think, helps us really understand that there are a lot of people who, let's say, may not feel comfortable talking about those in person, or also writing is a different art, right? Writing is an ability, and you have the ability to express yourself in a very different way. And so the other thing here is a wide-angled lens. And so the wide scope is useful when the population, let's say, of interest is large or diverse, or indeed, let's say, potentially unknown. So when perspectives from different groups within a wider population are sought, you really get a lot of rich data. So the wide scope of a qualitative survey also help mitigate risk in a way which can occur in typically smaller samples of interview research. That is, a participant who speaks from a particular, let's say, non-dominant social position, and they get treated kind of as the spokesperson for the particular demographic or background, rather than, just an individual. And the other things, as I said before, they're very affordable, they're easy to administer, and they're relatively accessible. Some disadvantages, there's a lot here. As I said, I won't spend too much time here, but they risk excluding participants with, let's say, limited literacy skills, either through, reassuring participants that they need not to be concerned about correct spelling or grammar, but that's only so much that we can mitigate. But then you also have digital literacy as well that potentially excludes a lot of other people who may not have access. So the other thing to keep in mind here is that online delivery also risks inadvertently, as I said before, excluding some of the least privileged and the most vulnerable groups in society. And those factors are really important to keep in mind during design, but also during your understanding of the limitations of your research. The other critique, and this is the one I said before that I would come back to, is oftentimes that you kind of you miss the depth of the data that's kind of lost in comparison to interviews. And so based on imagining what qualitative surveys cannot offer, and an idealization of what interviews will offer, it's really, really important to think through this, right? Because yes, qualitative surveys have the capacity may lack the capacity of that, those follow-up questions or those, picking up on bits and pieces here. But clearly, they do have the capacity to deliver rich and deep and complex data. And of course, not all survey data is going to be rich and nuanced. There's going to be really, limited responses, but most participants, let's say even in our study, really did provide really valuable accounts of their experiences and their perspectives. And some were like really long and richly like detailed and really lengthy. So that was really lovely to see. And so, as I said before, surveys really require us to reconceptualize and reassess the richness in terms of the data set as a whole. And also it really helps see, as we said before, instead of specific individual data items, but as more of a collective. And the other thing I think is in terms of disadvantages is obviously data security concerns that is ever growing and ever prominent, but also the building relations within a community that I think are really important. As someone who's has been and is an advocate for community-based research, oftentimes because it's, let's say, an online survey might be accessible to a very, very wide range of people, it may lose that community sense. But again, this can be monitored and changed with different ways. And so in conclusion, there's a lot of work that's being done around the importance of working with older people and their expressions and understandings. There's colleagues across the globe, and really, what we're really interested in is how old age really shapes and is shaped by, let's say, digital technologies and data objects and, kind of hyper digitization. And so our study is really this one step in discovering what we can learn about datafied societies and ageism, right? When we question and examine them with older people. And so in looking to next steps, we really hope that our project's part of this really larger project that aims to trace older people's experiences and understandings of digital devices. But what we hope to do next is really focus with older people and test out this creative data assemblage mapping exercise to hopefully render a more nuanced picture of older people's data realities. And so in this mapping exercise, we plan to visit older people in their homes and ask them to identify key data objects in their house. And through that, we're really curious about how being together with them in the space might evoke different responses and different answers or languages that they would use that we received, let's say, through the survey. And finally, as I said before, I think personally I've changed my mind about surveys. I've been trained in both quantitative and qualitative research. And I think moving from a quantitative lens to a qualitative lens, I was like, oh, I never have to do a survey again. But I think it really helps us continue to refine and develop how I would use a survey, but also think through some of these ideas that I've held about surveys. And so in sharing what I've learned, I really hope that social researchers will take these insights and, as a starting point to either devise their own surveys and really, have their own little adventures with online qualitative surveys. And so thank you. I will not speak. Hopefully we have some time for questions if you.
Yes, Stephanie, we do. We have a question in the chat there.
Okay. Great. Okay, so Lulu. Okay, so Lulu is so interesting just because cultural settings, elders are communally revered, and I suppose called elders first. You see ageism plaguing different social contexts in the same similar manners. Certain parts of the world and others, especially when. Great question, Lulu. I don't know if Lulu's still here. I know she sent me that she had to go, but it's interesting, right? we do, and again, I'm just getting into the field of ageism in tech, but ageism manifests in various different ways. And oftentimes we do see it in context or cultures or places that tend to be more individualistic in nature. Also where we see, let's say, heightened ideals around, or the lack of ideals around, community and culture. The other thing here is, as I said before, I am Greek. So for me, it's always really interesting when we talk about older people in a derogatory way or in a less than way. Whereas for me, for example, based off of even Lulu's question, is where in collectivistic cultures, elders and older people are revered and respected in a very different way. Not to say that ageism doesn't exist, but it's a very different language, and it's a very different social imaginary that we have for older people. So it's a great question, and it is something, unfortunately, that we don't have a lot of research on. But it's definitely makes an impact.
Okay. Any other questions for Stephanie?
Okay, so Caitlin, okay. Yeah, what are your thoughts about how older adult participants experience? That's great. I think it's funny because, as I said, we had quite a few responses that were like, thank you that we didn't have to, show up to McMaster or like take the bus and have no parking. Like, people were totally and loved the fact that it was online. They could do it from their homes. But we also had the people who were like, oh, I feel like, I wish I could have talked to you about this in person. Right. Those were very far and few between. As I said, we had about 70 respondents, but I think it was something that people felt. Again, I can't speak for them, but in the responses, they were very thoughtful responses. People engaged with the questions. And as I said, we had 15 or 16 questions, and they were thoughtful and they were paragraphs. And I feel like we wouldn't have gotten those responses if they were in person, to be honest, because people also have the ability to sit and let it marinate a little bit, right? Like, they have the ability to sit and let it sit, like write it out. And I don't know about you, but I'm definitely not as coherent when I'm speaking rather than writing. And so I think that also plays a role. And also, don't forget, like, there's a lot of people who prefer to not talk to someone. And I think that could also be intimidating to a certain degree. Talking to someone, let's say, about your life experiences that you've met once, that could be a bit daunting. So I feel like that was also really helpful to them too, of like, oh, I could just type it out and I can kind of have this experience in a way by myself. So yeah, and again, but that's another thing, right? We can examine that, do a study on how older people's experiences of the online survey through an online survey. I don't know, maybe too inception-y, but definitely a good question. Okay, another question. However, yeah, Edgar's talking about qualitative data. It can give you a lot of information. Yeah, it's true. Institutional surveys, yeah, 3,000 responses. How do you analyze it? More importance to long short. That's a great, I think quantitative data is different, obviously, than qual. In terms of long-ended and open-ended responses, it is going to take a lot more time. And that's why it's always a big, not pet peeve of mine, but when people talk about qualitative research as easier in some way, or, less demanding, it's like, oh, as someone who has done both, I can tell you the amount of effort and time that it has taken me to do, let's say a thematic analysis would take me, let's say if I was doing quantitative research, it would take me a week, and it would take me 6 months to do in qual work. So I don't know, Edgar, if there's necessarily an easy way to answer that question, because it takes time. But there is something to be said about limiting. In qualitative research, we have this idea of saturation as well. So it's like, once you see saturation, you kind of stop collecting responses. And so maybe monitoring that is something to keep in mind. I don't know if you currently have 3,000 responses. That does seem like a lot. But as I said, I wouldn't necessarily know exactly how to approach that, but I think you could, potentially thematically or chunk it out, or do, 1,000 responses and have all the lovely RAs and all the people involved in the project to think that through with. And if anybody, I don't know if any other questions, but feel free to email me if you do. I'm also on Twitter as well. Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And Stephanie, thank you for such a wonderful talk. It was really enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And as I said, feel free to follow me on Twitter or send me an email. And I wanted to also say a special thank you to Dr. Dahlmer and Dr. Bayerk for their work and their guidance and their lovely humanity in general. And yeah, thanks so much for everyone who came.